Hello and welcome to Dateline Democracy. My name is Peter Roussel, and at Sam Houston State University, I fulfill the Philip G. Warner Endowed Chair in the Department of Mass Communication. What is Dateline Democracy? This is an independent study class at Sam Houston where students have the opportunity to interview and meet with top media representatives. And I'm talking about top national media representatives, top of the line journalists, reporters who have been covering the 2020 presidential election and other events. And it's a chance for the students to discuss the campaign with them and also discuss their careers and how they got to be where they are today. And certainly in the case of today's guest, I would say she's right at the top of the line when it comes to journalism. So that's what Dateline Democracy is all about. And hopefully it's beneficial to these students as many of them are about to go out and launch their careers. And hopefully this will give them insights that are helpful to them in that process. This is all under the sponsorship of the College of Arts and Media and the Department of Mass Communication at Sam Houston State University. My co-host is clinical professor of political science, Mike Yon. And I'm going to turn it over to him in a few minutes so he and the students can begin their questions. But before I do, I would just like to make a personal comment about today's guest. I have known and worked with today's guest, Susan Page, since the Reagan administration that she covered as a reporter, and I was there as a spokesman for President Reagan. And I can tell you, every time I had to work with her there, it was a pleasure. I come from a family of newspaper journalists, both my mother and father, and I can tell you they both adhered to high standards in the pursuit of their craft. And I can also assure you that in my view, Susan Page adheres to those very, very high standards, and therefore I have very high regard for her. She has most recently, which many are familiar with, been the moderator for the vice presidential debate during this campaign just over. She has recently had a biography of Barbara Bush published, and she's in the process of finishing a biography on Nancy Pelosi that'll be published in 2021. And she has just come off having covered, what is it, Susan, her 11th or 12th presidential campaign? What is it? How many?
It's my 11th campaign. I have no other skills, so I'm very glad we keep holding elections.
Well, all of that adds up to a pretty, I think you'd have to say, a pretty amazing record. And we haven't even touched on the awards and honors and accolades that have come our way, but we'll do that here before the program's over. Susan, it's a pleasure to see you, first of all, to see you again. Secondly, to be working with you again, even if briefly. So welcome to Dateline Democracy.
Well, Pete, it's my pleasure to be here. You know, the first time you talked to me about coming and speaking to your class was when I was in Houston to interview you about Barbara Bush for that biography of Barbara Bush called The Matriarch. You were so helpful with that, as you've always been in the years that we've known each other. My only regret is that I can't be there in person because of this pandemic. I know that you have a wonderful campus, a terrific student body, and a beautiful hall there behind you. So it's my pleasure to be with you here tonight, even if just virtually.
Well, it's our honor to have you here. And I'll just say about you coming to this campus, hopefully we can do that at some point. But since you play a musical instrument, although you say you're not playing it anymore, that being the oboe, I'm in the process right now of working with a very talented member of the music department here at Sam Houston, and we're adapting my novel, Ruffled Flourishes, as a musical. So I think he'd be glad to write in an oboe part for that musical.
Yeah, well, good luck with that. It's only been several decades since I played the oboe. I'm sure I could pick it up with no trouble at all. It's such an easy instrument.
I have all faith in that. I might also add too, I've also been for many years a friend and working colleague of Susan's husband, Carl Lubsdorff. And I go back to 1970 with him, good golly. When he covered the Bush Senate race in Texas in 1970 when he was with AP. But anyway, Susan, let me just kick it off with a couple of questions here because I might not get another chance. So I'm going to jump in while I have the chance. Let me just take a brief trip because I know you're going to get questions about moderating the vice presidential debate. So I'm not going to dwell on that. I leave that to others. But let me take you down a little brief memory trip down memory lane to the Reagan White House. Was there any story or moment or situation that stands out for you from that experience of covering President Reagan?
Well, Pete, there are so many great experiences from covering President Reagan, traveling with him, with President Reagan in China and in Red Square, covering the aftermath of the shooting, an assassination attempt against President Reagan, these big historic events that you get to see close up when you're a White House correspondent. But I'll tell you, the story I most often tell about covering Reagan was an example of a failure on my part. President Reagan was the first sitting president I had ever interviewed. I was pretty much in awe of being in the Oval Office and talking to the President of the United States. I was working then for Newsday, the newspaper in New York. And I finished that interview and came out and realized I had not actually gotten any news because, of course, and I know you've seen this many times when people come in, people of all sorts, journalists and others, members of Congress, business leaders, they come in into the Oval Office, they talk to the president and they forget all the things that they wanted to ask them or they were going to press on them or the way they were going to get them to say something interesting. That was certainly what I did in my first presidential interview. And I decided then that if I ever got the privilege of a second presidential interview with any president, Reagan or someone else, that I would be better prepared and tougher. And I've got to say now I've interviewed a total of 9 presidents. None of them, all of them, I had a more successful interview than I did that first time with President Reagan.
Was that your first presidential interview?
It was. Now, the first national political figure I interviewed was George H.W. Bush during the 1980 primaries when he was really contesting the Iowa caucuses. And you know how courteous George H.W. Bush was to everyone, reporters and everyone else. So he gave me an interview on a flight from Des Moines to Philadelphia. And, you know, usually you would get, I realize this now, you'd get 15 minutes and be grateful for it, right? Yeah. But I didn't realize that. It was the first time I'd interviewed a presidential candidate. I plopped down next to him in Des Moines, and I don't think I got up and stopped talking to him until we landed in Philadelphia. And he never blinked an eye about the idea that he gave this extremely extended interview to the reporter for a New York paper who he had never heard of before. So that's another good memory from that campaign.
Well, but you know, that sounds just like him.
Yeah.
Why don't you, for the students, explain about Newsday?
So Newsday still exists. It's a newspaper on Long Island. It at the time was about the 10th largest newspaper in the country. You know, the newspaper industry has gone through a lot of turmoil since 1980 when I was working there. But it was a great newspaper, a big investigative newspaper. I worked there. That's where I went to work when I graduated from college. I covered a local beat. Then I went down to Washington and covered the White House, and then went to USA Today to cover the White House.
How long had you been there before you started covering the White House?
So let's see, I've been at Newsday maybe 5 years, I guess, before I started covering the White House. It was serendipitous. You know, I had some opportunities. I covered a local beat, then I went on I became Newsday's only national correspondent. So I went out on stories, breaking stories across the country for about a year. Then there was an opening in the Washington Bureau and I went there, and I've just never done anything else since, basically, than cover the White House and national politics. Well,
as we say at the first, you paid your dues.
Yeah. And, you know, worked hard, but lucky all the way. And what a wonderful.
You're not going to convince me of that. You've got talent.
You know, journalism's such a great career. You know, it's such an interesting thing to do. It's such a privilege, really, to be a journalist. And I feel that way to this day.
Well, that's an admirable way to express it. And I agree with you, certainly agree with you. Hey, I come from a newspaper family. I better agree with you. You know, you and I were talking before we came on the air here about the newspaper industry today. And I know as a kid, one of the most exciting things I would do when I was 5 or 6 years old was go down to the city room of the Houston Post at night when my dad was there writing his column. And just stepping into that city room was like, for me, it was like stepping into a world of magic. I said, what could be more exciting than this? And I asked him one time, I said, Dad, why did you choose this as a profession? He said, he had a great answer. I thought he said, this is where you put the world together every day. And so be it. Well, I'm taking up the time here, and this program is about the students. So Mike, you want to take it away here.
Well, before I turn it over to the students, Ms. Page, I have a couple of questions for you. And I'm going to preface this question. You are, was this our fourth guest, Peter?
Yes.
You are our fourth and youngest guest. But as a near septuagenarian, what do you think? I mean, you know, when I try to talk to my students, they've got two people in their mid to late 70s running for president. And I wonder, you know, first of all, with the students, they're 18, 20, 22 years old. You know, do they really connect? But also just what kind of energy level is required? And you have a job that requires something of the same energy level. Can you just kind of comment on the candidates' ages and how that might affect their presidency? I say candidates, and Joe Biden is the president-elect. But either way, whichever president would have won, and even 4 years ago, Hillary would now be in her 70s. So just age in the presidency.
So I think that's a very fair question to ask, especially given all the demands we put on presidents. We can see with every president the way they age from the day they're inaugurated until the day they leave office. I will say that with President Trump, you can love him or hate him, but the question is not whether he has enough energy to be president. He's very energetic. He's demonstrated that with all the rallies he did this fall, even despite the COVID-19 pandemic. And in fact, I think he found it difficult personally when he wasn't able to go out and do those big rallies because he really drew a lot of energy from them. So there may be questions that people have about President Trump on one thing or another, but energy was not his problem. I think that's been the subject of discussion with President-elect Biden. He'll be the oldest president in our history when he is inaugurated in January. COVID-19 made his campaign this year less a demonstration of energy than they typically are, because as President Trump liked to point out, he campaigned mostly from his home in Wilmington, Delaware. But we'll find out. It's a grueling job. And one of the things I think is a little distressing is we've gotten out of the habit in the 2016 campaign and again in 2020 with getting an actual solid read on the health of the candidates. There had previously been a kind of tradition, not a requirement, but a tradition of the nominees for president allowing there to be pretty complete disclosure of basic health information. President Trump hasn't done that. This year, Vice President Biden didn't do much of that either. So we're electing these presidents even at their age without knowing as much about their health as we used to know.
Yeah, thank you. Just to follow up with that, I mean, but there's also, besides energy, there's an awareness of cutting edge trends. So if you talk to our students, they're very familiar with every app that's available. But you know, some of the big questions about privacy, about the apps, you know, software programs, privacy, cameras. Is that a question a person in their late 70s should be deciding for the rest of the 21st century? And it's not a partisan thing, because the same question would be appropriate for Donald Trump or Hillary Clinton.
You know, Mike, I don't know if you saw the congressional hearings, the Senate hearings, where the heads of the big social media platforms, in which it became clear that the senators, who tend to be on the older side as well, had no idea what they were talking about when it came to Facebook and Google and some of the questions. Yeah, it was like you were watching a Saturday Night Live skit of your grandparents trying to work the remote on the TV. So these are big questions, and one reason I think it didn't get quite as much attention during this campaign as we might, not just privacy concerns about the big tech, antitrust concerns, whether big tech has gotten too big and unified, whether it ought to be broken up. These are big questions that we might be thinking about, except that we had so much bigger problems to debate during this campaign. You know, when after COVID-19 burst on the scene at the beginning of the year, that was really the topic that was front and center. COVID-19 and the economic repercussions that we saw coming in. Instead, I'd like, for instance, I wonder, what did your school do in terms of in-person learning or remote learning? And our kids now back on campus there?
They are. It's a mixed session. We have more students off campus, but we did invite students back. We are offering in-person classes, hybrid classes, and online, and we have a good mix of students availing themselves of all of those options.
So at a time, 250,000 of Americans have died of COVID-19, and we have millions of Americans out of work, fearing eviction, some of them in families that are hungry. It's as though some of the debate over app privacy with some of these social apps has taken a second tier, but they'll be back. We'll defeat this virus. Such great news this week in terms of the development of a vaccine. And at that time, I think we'll get back to questions like the one you pose.
Okay, and now for the real hard-hitting journalism. I mean, this is called Dateline Democracy. So who signed those baseballs over your left shoulder?
So it's my husband. My husband's a big baseball fan, and that's a collection of a variety of baseballs. Carl, tell me who signed some of them.
There's one that was a ball I caught at Yankee Stadium and is autographed by Joe DiMaggio.
Okay, we'll just do that one. What, the best one? Joe DiMaggio.
Yeah, that's all you need to know that's the best one.
A ball he got at Yankee Stadium, and Joe DiMaggio later autographed. And the others are from his long love affair with baseball.
Okay.
Hey Carl, would you be interested in a ball signed by Bush 41 and Nolan Ryan?
Bush 41 and Nolan Ryan.
What about them?
Would you like a baseball signed by the two of them?
I love it.
He would love it. So.
And then who's the bobblehead? Is that Mikhail Gorbachev? Who is that?
Oh, over
William
there.
Loeb.
It's William Loeb, the former editor of the Manchester Union Leader.
I bet that was a big seller.
Well, Carl and I have both covered a lot of New Hampshire primaries.
That's right. Yeah, in the cold. Okay. Well, that's all of our hard-hitting journalism today. We're going to turn it over to the students now. And we've got the students will be asking questions in sort of a prearranged order and what interests them. So it's going to be all over the place because they may circle back and cover the same topics. So be on your toes. And our first student is Nick Henson.
Hello.
Hi.
Hi, my name is Nick Henson. I'm a mass communication student for Sam Houston State University. And my question for you was essentially, so out of all the presidents that you have interviewed, which one was probably like your most favorite and probably the most fruitful?
So I wouldn't say most favorite, but I would say the president who was the best to interview, I think, was Bill Clinton. Because Clinton really liked reporters. He really first of all, he liked reporters, and also he loved to talk. So that's a good combination when you're interviewing somebody. He was very engaged in the details of policy. So it was possible to talk to him in depth about things. And he was, you almost always walked away from an interview with Bill Clinton having found out something you didn't know when you walked in. And that's really your goal when you do an interview. Clinton was also someone who was pretty much thought there was a real value in talking to USA Today because, you know, he had come from Arkansas. So it was some presidents like President Obama loved the New York Times. With President Clinton, he was focused on USA Today and its reach across the middle of the country, places like Arkansas where he had come from. So as a result, I had the privilege of getting a lot of interviews with Clinton over his 8 years in office. So that was great. So it's not an ideological issue about who was best to interview, but in terms of being able to see him and coming out with some news, I'd say Clinton was the best.
Okay, thank you very much.
Nick, you want to follow that up with another question?
Yeah, sure. Sorry, one second.
Hey, Nick, can I tell you can I guess your follow-up question, which would be,
Yeah, sure.
tell me about one interview you did with Clinton. So
Oh, sure.
I had one interview with Clinton where I was supposed to interview him with my colleague, Mimi Hall. He was going to Chicago to do an event, and we were supposed to interview him on the way back on Air Force One. So Mimi and I go to Chicago and we go to his event, and we then go back on Air Force One, and we're supposed to interview him on the way back. And as Pete knows, when you interview a president on Air Force One, you sit in the back of the plane and they come and get you and take you up to the front of the plane where there's an office, a presidential office that has a big kind of horseshoe desk and a couch along the edge. And it's really a working office for the president. And we're sitting there and we're flying and we're flying and we're flying, and then they are coming to get us. And I started to think they're going to give us a 2-minute interview because, of course, once you land at Andrews after a long day, the president tends to want to go back to the White House and not talk to reporters. And I'm getting more and more pissed off because I'm sure that I'm going to get screwed in terms of time with President Clinton. So I think it was Joe Lockhart who came finally to kind of fetch us. And I said, Joe, you cannot give us a 2-minute interview. I think when he got us, we were like beginning the landing process at Andrews. And he said, no, we'll take care of you. So we go into the office, the presidential office, and we start interviewing Clinton. And this is a few weeks before the Monica Lewinsky scandal broke. And he was very optimistic about reaching a deal with Senate Republicans that would trade their big tax deal that would also involve Social Security. I mean, one of these things that come along not so often, the ingredients come together to really do something big with Congress. And he's talking about this in some detail. And the interview is going, and we've landed at Andrews by then. So we're sitting on the tarmac at Andrews, and by this time, the interview's gone on for so long, I'm really surprised that Joe Lockhart hasn't said, okay, your time is up, you have to stop. And I glance over at Joe Lockhart and he's fallen asleep. So he's sitting in a chair and he is like totally out of it. And Clinton, as I said, loved to talk. This interview goes on and on and on, the longest interview I've ever had with the president. Joe Lockhart finally wakes up, realizes that he has fallen asleep, that he has no idea what Clinton said, and that this interview has gone on much too long. And he goes, okay, this is over. And then the interview ended.
Joe, for y'all, Joe Lockhart was the press secretary at the time.
Yes.
Nick, go ahead with your actual follow-up, and thank you for that story about the inside of Clinton time, as they used to call it.
Right. Well, my other question that I had was, what was your inspiration, like your biggest inspiration for the book that you wrote, your first book?
So my biggest inspiration was that I wanted to write a book.
Right.
And I wanted to write a book about something I'd covered. So this was what I was thinking. I wanted to write a book about something I'd covered because that would give me a kind of running start, and something that hadn't been covered to death, like something about which there was something new to say. And I met with these two guys who became my agents, although they weren't my agents at that time. And we were just talking about what would be a possible topic. And I said, well, you know, the Bush administrations were just over, maybe something about the relationship between George W. Bush and George H.W. Bush. It turned out there was another book actually already in the works on that. And one of these guys, Matt Latimer, said, what about Barbara Bush? And I said, you know, Barbara Bush is really interesting. And I think she was powerful in a way people don't understand, and complicated. And I hadn't covered the first lady, but I'd covered her kind of because I was always covering the president, both when her husband was president and when her son was president. And I thought that was a great idea. So what we actually did was, I don't know if this is the way you're supposed to do it because I hadn't done a book before, but this is the way I did this. I wrote a proposal for a Barbara Bush book. We sold it to a publisher. Only then did I write Barbara Bush a note, an email, a letter, but I sent it electronically, saying I'd signed a contract to write a book about her and I hope she would cooperate. And the reason I didn't check with her beforehand was I thought if she said no, then I would be maybe not, maybe I'd chicken out. And I thought if she said yes, she might think she had some sway over what I wrote if she had agreed to it. And that was kind of the way in which I proceeded with getting a contract. So to my relief, she said I could come to Houston and do one interview. And at the end of the first interview, she said I could have a second interview. And at the end of the second interview, she said I could have a third interview. And I ended up having 5 long interviews with her in Houston over 5 months, and was actually back in Texas for the 6th interview when she fell into her final illness and died. So my inspiration was more like, gee, I think I'd like to write a book. And then the idea that Barbara Bush is somebody whose story had not really been told.
Great
One
questions.
other thing about, so when I sent the note to her saying, I hope you'll let me interview you. And of course, at that point, it could have been a big problem if she had said no. I simultaneously sent emails to George W. Bush and to Jeb Bush saying, by the way, I've signed a contract to do a biography of your mother, and I hope you'll encourage her to cooperate. And Jeb Bush, who as you may know, responds very quickly to emails, almost immediately, like 30 seconds later, sent me an email back, and it was 3 words long. He said, "Does mother know?" So anyway.
Did you answer truthfully?
I did. I said, well, she doesn't, I just sent her this email, so I guess maybe she doesn't know yet.
Great questions, Nick. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
And our next questions are from Savannah.
She is.
Hello, Miss Susan Page. My name is Savannah Moffett. I attend Sam Houston State University, and I'm a kinesiology major with a minor in mass communication. And you kind of answered my first question regarding Miss Barbara Bush and Miss Nancy Pelosi's book that you'll be publishing in 2021, which I greatly appreciate as far as me being a writer myself for a book that I'm writing. So I wanted to go ahead and ask my second question, which is, the Gridiron Club is one of the most prestigious and oldest organizations for journalists that only accept membership through invitation only. Was it ever your goal to be a part of the club, and how did you feel knowing that you, as well as your husband, were able to hold the presidency position?
Well, thanks so much for your question. But let me ask you, what is your book about?
It's a non-fictional book I'm currently writing, and it basically just discusses the different things that minorities go through and different ways of expressing those emotions, because a lot of things within the African American community doesn't get talked about with the traumas that we go through. So it's more so targeting those different outlets that are essential for expressing those emotions.
Well, that sounds great. Good luck with your book.
Thank you.
So the Gridiron Club is this, it's the oldest association of journalists in Washington. It exists it doesn't have a very high-minded reason for existing. We give a big dinner in the spring where we do a funny show, or a show that we think is funny, where we do skits and songs and stuff, and where a lot of the Washington officials come. And it's a club with real fellowship among the members. The Gridiron Club was something I didn't like. At the point I got into the Gridiron Club, as you said, it's by invitation. You have to be sponsored. It was really not a time when I thought I was likely to get into the Gridiron Club, but Helen Thomas actually nominated me. And Helen, who, famous Helen Thomas, real great, groundbreaking female journalist, she was very focused on not only breaking ground herself for women in journalism, but bringing other women along with her. So she nominated me for the Gridiron Club at a time when it hadn't really occurred to me that that would happen for me. So I am grateful to her, and I've tried to follow her example. Sort of like what we heard Kamala Harris say at the victory speech she gave the other night in Wilmington, where she said, "I'm going to be the first woman in this position at vice president, but I'm not going to be the last." And that is, I think, a really great attitude for people to take when they're the first in something, whether they're the first African American or the first female or the first gay person. Groundbreakers, I think, who put a hand back and help somebody else up, I think I think that's a good attitude to take.
And Savannah, you have a follow-up, switching venues a bit.
Oh, it was just a question regarding her being the published author for her biographies that she written.
Yep. Didn't you have a question about the vice presidential debate, Savannah?
Oh, I did. But Dr. Roussel told me to just have a follow-up just in case.
Okay. Okay. All right. Well, thank you, Savannah. And I think next we have Cody McDowell, who's got a job to get to. He's one of the people who've survived COVID with a job. So Cody, congratulations, and go ahead and fire away with your questions.
Hi, Susan. My name is Cody McDowell. I'm from Austin, Texas, and I too am a senior at Sam Houston State. My question for you is, as a child, what inspired you to step into a predominantly male-dominated realm of reporting on the national level? And was the national level your end goal when getting into it?
Hey, Cody, thanks for your question. Did you actually have COVID? Is that what they were saying?
No, I'm sorry. I was just saying he has survived the COVID pandemic while keeping a job.
Ah, I see.
So he's not one of the 20% that at one time were unemployed. So congratulations, Cody.
Yeah, that's good. I know you have to get to work. What kind of job do you do?
I'm actually a volunteer at a food shelter to deal with the coronavirus.
And have you seen a lot of families come in who need food aid?
Me being one of those families, yes.
Yeah, it's really been one of the heartbreaking things to see, the amount of kids who are hungry. One of my sons is a middle school teacher at a school with a lot of low-income families, and I think he sees a lot of things going on that makes you hope this pandemic is over soon. In terms of Pete talked about how he felt when he went into the newsroom at the Houston Post with his dad when he was little. And one of the things that happened with me, I think, is that when I went into a newsroom and I worked first at my high school paper and then at my college paper, it's like that was where I was supposed to be, like from the first time I walked in, I sort of felt like this feels very much like where I belong. And I think that doesn't happen just with journalists. I think there are people who are doctors and nurses, they walk into a hospital and they feel that way, or teachers who walk into a classroom and it just feels like the right place to be. And I do think those of us who find something that we just really love to do are the luckiest people to have jobs that fit us. When I started to work as a journalist, I did not necessarily want to cover politics. I just wanted to be a reporter. And I think that in retrospect, I could be a reporter covering other things if my path could have been different than it was. But national politics, obviously, really interesting thing to do and important. It's where things happen that affect our lives and our children's lives and the course of the country. So it wasn't exactly a goal, but it's like I took one day at a time, one step at a time, one job at a time, and this is where I've ended up.
Well, thank you.
Yeah.
Cody, I think you've got two other questions. Either one of them would be good follow-ups. Do you want to go ahead with one of those?
Sure, of course. I've noticed a lot of media backlash on Twitter, Instagram, social media, such of all that, about the harshness and brutality of the presidential debates. Out of the presidential elections that you have covered, have you ever seen something as radically intense as the Biden-Trump or Trump-Hillary debates?
Just not just the debates, the whole campaigns. Campaigns can be rough and they can be dirty and they can be negative. That's not new, that happens. The stakes are really high. It'd be surprising if campaigns weren't pretty tough. But the campaigns we've had these last two elections have been something like we've never seen before, I think. I think they've really been pretty brutal. And I think social media has contributed to that. I think it contributes also, the kind of polarization we see where people have divided into kind of armed camps when it comes to politics. I think that both makes the campaigns more brutal, and then the campaigns being more brutal makes people more polarized. So we get into a situation where it's just hard, I think, sometimes for people on two sides to even talk to each other anymore. I know, we won't have a Thanksgiving dinner this year because of the pandemic, and that makes me sad. But it's also true that at our family Thanksgiving dinner, sometimes the politics the last couple of years have been really tough, because like after 2016, we had Trump voters, Hillary Clinton voters, and Jill Stein voters all around the Thanksgiving table. And we've just gotten to a place in our country where it's hard for us to listen to one another. I don't know if any of you have had that same experience with your families. I hope we get past this. I hope we get back to a time where we can disagree and vote for different people, but not think of the other side as being our enemy.
Cody, thank you very much for your questions, and thank you for your volunteer work.
It's not a problem at all.
And Ms. Page, I think we have a follow-up from Mikaela Hubert, who wants to explore that debate experience a little bit more. So Mikaela, when you're ready, just fire away.
Hello, my name is Mikaela Hubert. I am a senior mass communication student from Houston, Texas. So my question for you is, how do you prepare yourself to moderate a debate?
Okay, well, that's such a great question because I hadn't done a debate before, so I wasn't really sure how to prepare. Frank Fahrenkopf, who's a former Republican national chairman, called me like a month before the debate and said, would you like to moderate the vice presidential debate? And I said, yeah, absolutely. That sounds really like a big honor and a thrill. And it was funny because he and I had breakfast like 4 years earlier to talk about the debates for that cycle. And he said, it's too bad you could never be a moderator for the debates because we only use TV people. So I never thought, it was kind of like being asked to join the Gridiron Club. I never thought I'd be the moderator of a debate. So I was pretty thrilled when he called. At that point, we formed a little team at USA Today, an editor, a reporter, an intern, and myself. And we detached ourselves from the rest of the newsroom, and we just worked for the next 4 weeks on doing research, devising questions, trying to think through how a debate would work. And so it was it was like something I've never done before, a pretty intense process and just super interesting. And it was funny, I thought I might be really nervous for the debate. And I was nervous in some ways, but once we sat down in the debate hall, and there was, Mike Pence and Kamala Harris and I were each at a desk. We were 12 feet apart because of the pandemic, but I couldn't really see anything else. I mean, there were people behind me in the hall, but not that many people because, again, of the pandemic, there were only 100 or so people in the hall. And I felt like all I was aware of were the two of them and myself. And I was not nervous. People can think I did a bad job or a good job, but I felt pretty confident about the questions that we had. And I think part of that is because I had spent a month doing nothing else but thinking about it. The one thing that was a big surprise, so I walk off, so it's over. I walk off stage and all anybody is talking about is the fly. And I'm like, what fly? Because I couldn't see the fly. And it was really just about the only thing people were talking about afterwards.
How does that make you feel, Susan, when you spill your journalistic guts out there and the story is the fly?
Well, it is what it is. It was just like, I just felt like what an experience. It was great to do. And then I was on Saturday, someone portraying me was on Saturday Night Live that Saturday. So that was pretty cool too.
And Mikaela, you have a follow-up about to Ms. Page that might actually affect your future.
Yes, absolutely. So my follow-up question for you is, what do you think needs to change within the news industry to make sure female journalists get the recognition they deserve?
Yes, I think female journalists, African American journalists, Native American journalists. I mean, I think there are a lot of rising forces in America that need to be represented in our newsrooms. Makes a big difference, I think, to have a diverse newsroom in every way, diverse in gender and race and religion and maybe economic upbringing. I mean, so I think it's important to have people who came from different sorts of life experiences in a newsroom. And I think there is, it's a time of some turmoil for the news industry. We're still figuring out how to have business models that pay for the journalism we want to do. But I definitely think that's an important part of it. And there's been, so with the whole racial reckoning, the marches for racial justice this year, this has been something I think a lot of newsrooms have been thinking about as well. So do you want to be a reporter yourself?
Yes, I do. I would love to work for ABC 13 sometime in the future.
And ABC 13 is you mean the local television station?
Yes, ma'am, in Houston.
Yeah. And so have you tried to have an internship there or work there so far?
I was looking for an internship over the summer, but then COVID hit and whatnot. And so it just didn't work out for me.
Well, internships are great ways to get experience and also just to figure out what you like doing. So I had a lot of internships when I was a student, first at my hometown paper, the Wichita Eagle in Wichita, Kansas. And then I had a summer internship at the Milwaukee Journal and then at the Minneapolis Star Tribune. And those were important ways for me to figure out like how does journalism work and what about journalism is it that I want to do? So I definitely recommend trying to pursue that as you look at a journalism career. It's a great career. Love journalism. Couldn't recommend it more.
Thank you so much.
Yeah,
Great questions, Mikaela, and best of luck to you. Okay, and one of our harder hitting questioners is Meredith Charlton. She's got a political science background. So Meredith, why don't you hit on your topics that are popular tonight?
Hi, Mrs. Page. It's good to meet you. My name is Meredith Charlton. I'm from Houston, Texas, and a junior political science major here at SAM. And the first question I had for you was, having moderated the vice presidential debate, I was wondering, just you having moderated it and being a journalist, whether or not you felt that some kind of live fact checking would have been warranted or necessary to better combat some of the misinformation from any three of the debates.
Yeah. Gee, Meredith, that's such a great question because it's something we really thought hard about. You know, I talked to the debate commission and I also before the debate and also with people that had moderated debates before who were very helpful. And I think it's something that we all struggle with because on the one hand, fact checking is an important part of what journalists do. And journalists are doing more and more fact checking because President Trump would, especially while various politicians sometimes say things that are untrue, this particularly has become a challenge with President Trump saying things that are untrue and saying them even after they've been fact checked to be shown to be untrue. So it's something that we've taken a kind of a ramped up attitude about in the past 4 or 5 years. Now the question is, during the debate itself, do you want to do live fact checking by the moderator? And one of the things that we thought about was, what is the goal? What is the role of the moderator? And the role of a moderator, I think, is different than the role of a journalist doing an interview. Because if you're doing an interview, you are really free to interject yourself to try to cut the person off if they're going on, to try to challenge them if they say something that isn't true. I think that's not quite what you're supposed to do when you're the moderator of the debate. I think your role as the moderator of the debate is to try to disappear, to try to set up a situation where the two candidates interact with each other, get a chance to say their piece, but chance to challenge one another. In a way, it's more the role of the opposition candidate to challenge than it is the moderator. Now, not everybody agrees with that. And there are different ways to different kinds of debates to have. But that was the attitude I took going into that. How can I ask a question that is as sharply honed as possible, and then hopefully get the two candidates to engage each other on that. The other thing I was really focused on was making sure they got roughly equal time. And that's something else that I would have been less concerned about if I'd been doing an interview than being the moderator of the debate. And when the debate started, Mike Pence would not shut up and was taking up a lot more time than Kamala Harris. And after about 15 minutes, I had actually on the desk before me 4 clocks, and 2 of them showed the cumulative time that each candidate had talked. So I had one that showed exactly how many seconds, minutes and seconds Pence had talked, and how many minutes and seconds Harris had talked. And after about 15 minutes, Pence was like 2-to-1 in time with Harris. And I thought that was unfair, especially in a situation where Kamala Harris, who was not well known nationally, this was her introduction to a lot of voters. So one of the things I focused on was trying to make sure they had roughly equal time, which was kind of a challenge. And if you'll let me brag about something, when the debate was over, CNN had also been running cumulative clocks, and Mike Pence got 36 minutes and 27 seconds, and Kamala Harris got 36 minutes and 24 seconds. So whatever else you think about the debate I moderated, I did give them equal time. What do you think? What do you think? Do you think there should be more fact checking on the fly during a presidential and vice presidential debate?
Personally, with some of the misinformation I feel like we saw in the first debate, more so than the other two, I think it would have been worth it to try to figure something out to do that. That's not necessarily that the moderator should have been that role, but that something maybe should have been figured out or could have been figured out.
You know, that first debate was such a mess because President Trump didn't respect the rules that had been laid out before the debate, agreed to by the campaigns. Chris Wallace, I mean, I don't know what he was supposed to do. And that was the reason that the commission added the mute button to the second presidential debate. And I've been a little bit of a skeptic about the mute button, but I thought it worked really well. And I know that Chris wishes he had a mute button during the first debate. Because, you know, it was frustrating for Biden, but more importantly, I think it was frustrating for Americans who were watching it and wanted to get a sense of these two candidates. So these debates, you know, they're definitely a work in progress. Not that they can't be improved, but I worry if people get frustrated with them and don't think they're valuable, because if we don't have debates, all we'll see of these candidates are, we won't see them together. We'll see their paid TV ads, and we'll see the interviews they choose to do with friendly interviewers, and that'll be it. So I really hope this commitment to debates continues.
And Meredith, Meredith has a follow-up, so I'll let her ask that, but I wanted to also just follow up as well. The students may be interested in this. I don't know for Trump and Biden what the agreements were, but Bush versus Gore, the legal documents that they signed ahead of time were 37 pages long. And they got down to, Al Gore is a taller individual than George Bush. So I think at the time, out of the last 15 presidential elections, the taller candidate had won 14. So Bush had a thing in there that said that the two could not appear more than 6 feet together in proximity. And then Gore in the last debate there's a famous scene of him kind of walking up there. Again, it's smart to violate the rules if you're going to in the last debate so that you sort of get the last word. But are you privy to those sort of agreements ahead of time, Susan?
So those agreements are negotiated by the campaigns and the Commission on Presidential Debates and do not involve the moderator. And I'll tell you something else, the campaigns do not get to choose the moderator. The commission announces the moderators without consultation with the campaigns, which was not the way it used to work. And you got in this situation where each campaign, it was like you were trying to seat a jury and each campaign kept knocking reporters off. So they went to a situation where the Commission on Presidential Debates simply chooses the moderator. Those negotiations didn't involve me. Here's what the commission told me. They said, do 9 topics for 10 minutes each. Each candidate gets 2 minutes to speak first and then have a free discussion in each of these 9 topics. And the rest is up to you. So I didn't tell the commission or the campaigns what the topics were. And I struggled to keep them to 10 minutes. And in fact, we only did 8 topics because we went long on various topics. So immigration, which had been a topic I'd hoped to get to, we didn't get to. One of the debates, one of the things that they negotiated was whether to stand or sit, because traditionally vice presidential debates have been seated, but there was a disagreement between the campaigns. I think Mike Pence wanted to sit and Kamala Harris wanted to stand, and that was one of the final things that was negotiated shortly before the debate began. I mean, not hours before, but days before.
Thank you. And Meredith, sorry for that interruption, but would you like to follow up with your other question?
Yeah, so the other question that I wanted to ask you was, I knew that you are writing a book about Nancy Pelosi coming out in 2021 that Savannah spoke to. But I was wondering what you could tell us about that. And was it surprising to hear individuals say that you couldn't be unbiased during the debate because you were writing a book on Nancy Pelosi, despite having also written a book about Barbara Bush, who's a Republican figure?
So I felt like I had real protection there because I feel like each book gave me protection the other way. And I actually, one thing I talked about what I did before the debate. The other thing I went off before the debate was to go off social media because it was all so mean. I mean, it was just like denouncing me from both sides. And I decided that that wasn't going to be emotionally healthy. So I went off social media for a month. I missed it some, but it was really necessary. And when the debate was over, I also didn't go on social media for about a week because social media is just can be really, really mean. I did not get any flack from either campaign about whether they thought I would be fair or not. So I didn't, when others criticize me, it's like, well, that's what happens.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Meredith. Okay, and thank you for those responses. Those two are really popular. The debate and your books are popular among our students right now. And next we have Heather Inman. Heather, you want to join us and fire away?
Hello, Mrs. Page. My name is Heather Inman, and I'm a junior here at Sam Houston State. And my major is psychology with a minor in mass communication. And my question for you is, what are some of the biggest changes you have seen in women in journalism from the time you started until now?
Yeah, Heather, thanks for that question. So when I started in journalism, there were many fewer women. There are a lot of women in journalism now, it's great. But when I started, there were not that many women as reporters, and there were even fewer women in positions of power as editors and publishers and bureau chiefs. I'll tell you something that happened during the Reagan administration, which is there were only 2 women covering the Reagan two women covering the Reagan White House for newspapers. One was Ann Devroy of the Washington Post, and the other was me. I was working for Newsday. And my husband, Carl Lubsdorff of the Dallas Morning News, was also covering the White House then. And when we went on trips, and Carl and I were both on presidential trips, Carl and I would stay in the same hotel room. So the White House travel office would book us into one hotel room because we were married. And there was a trip that I didn't go on, and Carl goes on, and he checks into his hotel room, and he goes into the room, and there's Ann Devroy, because in my absence, they had just, I mean, somehow all women look alike, I guess. They assumed that he must be married to her, and so they booked them into the same hotel room. That's how interchangeable we seemed, I think, to some of the men who were running things in the Reagan White House. And in fact, in the Reagan White House, officials often confused Ann and me. They'd call me Ann, they'd call her Susan, which I thought was sort of funny, but she found quite annoying. That wouldn't happen so much today. You know, now about half the press corps at the White House is female. And now a lot of the bureau chiefs in town are female as well. The bureau chief for the Associated Press is female. The Washington bureau chief for the New York Times is a woman. The bureau chief for USA Today is female. So there's really been some big changes. In fact, if you look at USA Today, I'm the Washington Bureau chief is female, but my editor, the editor-in-chief, Nicole Carroll, is a woman, and so is the publisher, Maribel Wadsworth Perez. So that just exemplifies some of the big sweeping changes we've seen in journalism. Are you interested in journalism yourself?
A little bit, yes. I'm more interested in like PR, but similar, yeah. Yeah.
Well, thanks for that question. It's been one of the big sea changes in the years I've been a journalist.
Thank you for your answer.
And Heather, I think you had a question. I think she's answered some of your questions about Barbara Bush, but you had a question about the possibility of contacting President Bush as well. Why don't you follow up and explore what you wanted to there?
Yes, my other question was, when did you start interviewing Barbara Bush for your book, The Matriarch, and were you able to interview George Herbert Walker Bush for the book too?
Yeah, so I made 5 trips to Houston to interview her about once a month. That was great. It was fantastic. And she was a great interview because you ask her a question, she would just answer it. As Pete can tell you. She was, and she'd always been pretty candid, but man, at the age of 90, she was super candid. I interviewed George H.W. Bush as well. Now, he was in declining health at that point. He was really struggling with the complications from a form of Parkinson's disease. But I was able to interview him, and I said, President Bush, if you hadn't married Barbara Pierce, would you still have become president? And of course, the politically correct answer is to say, no, she's been crucial. She was by my side. We were partners. And he said, yes, I think I would have.
Do you think that's true, Susan?
I think he was a very ambitious and skilled and talented guy, but I think that Barbara Bush played a big role in his success. But I love the fact that he was willing to say what he actually thought, which is that he would have become president in any case. I then went around and asked almost everybody I interviewed what they thought about that question. And the oldest people I interviewed, the people that were roughly the ages of the Bush, of Barbara and George H.W. Bush, some of them said yes, he would have anyway. But the younger the person was that I interviewed, the less likely they were to say that. And for their grandchildren, I interviewed several of their grandchildren, none of them could even make sense of the question. It was so obvious that she was crucial.
Great question, Heather.
Thank you.
Okay, I think up next we have Danielle, if we have Danielle on hand here. And Danielle, I think you've got some timely questions about the election, so fire away.
Okay. Hi, my name is Danielle Garza, and I'm a senior at Sam Houston, and I'm majoring in mass communication. And my question is, what are your thoughts on President Trump's claims of voter fraud?
Well, thanks very much. That certainly is a timely question. So far, we have not seen any evidence of significant voter fraud. With the president, of course, within his rights to pursue legal challenges. And if he comes up with evidence of significant voter fraud, I'm sure the courts will consider that. But as of now, we haven't seen that. We haven't seen that in states that have Democratic secretaries of state running elections, and in states like Georgia, where we have Republicans as secretary of state running elections. What do you think? Do you think there was significant voter fraud?
No.
Yeah, it's been a weird end of the election, hasn't it? That foreign leaders, including foreign leaders that who've been closely associated with President Trump, have called and congratulated Joe Biden as the president-elect, but the outgoing president has not. It's nearly never, in my lifetime, there's never been a situation like this.
Danielle, if I can interrupt for just a second. Peter and Susan, if you had to guess right now, will Donald Trump be at the inauguration? Not as president-elect, but as the outgoing president showing off to the world our peaceful transition in a democracy. Will he be there?
So I'm unencumbered by actual information in response to that question, but I would say I would not be surprised if he did not attend.
Peter?
Your guess is as good as mine.
Ever the
that's a
spokesperson,
answer, isn't it?
ever the careful spokesperson, Peter. Danielle, what do you think? Is Donald Trump going to be there to show the world that America hands over power peacefully?
In my opinion, no, I don't think so.
Okay. Now that you've answered questions, you're free to do a follow-up.
Okay, and my follow-up question is, do you think that the relationship between journalists will be back to normal now that President-elect Joe Biden will be in office?
So I think they'll be more cordial than they've been these last 4 years. You know, Joe Biden's been around forever and knows a lot of reporters, has had very good relationship with reporters in the past. He's a very friendly guy, just personally, and is well liked. I mean, that's true of members of Congress as well as for journalists. But I don't think we immediately snap back to the way things worked before Donald Trump. And one sign of that is that in the transition, the Biden transition has not been having daily briefings. They have not been subjecting themselves to Q&A sessions like we became accustomed to before 2016. You know, we'll see if the Biden White House reinstitutes the daily press briefing, with which Pete is very familiar. You know, I think it'll be more normal, but I don't think it'll be exactly as it was before. And I think that's true with relations with the press, with relations with foreign governments, with dealings with Congress. I just think there's going to be an effect, an imprint of the past 4 years of the Trump administration that we're going to be dealing with in a lot of different ways.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Can I just jump in for a second? Susan, do you still ever go over to the briefing when they're
Well,
doing?
there's been no regular briefing for years. You know, they went away from the daily briefing pretty early on. And then when they started the coronavirus daily briefings, which kind of revived it, there have been strict restrictions on who can attend those because, of course, the press corps is as vulnerable to getting the coronavirus as everybody else. So the seats are assigned. You can see when you see them in the briefing rooms, people are socially distanced in the briefing room. So it's just not anything like it was before.
And Susan, before we get to our last student questioner, I wanted to just follow up on Danielle's question. And Peter, you know about this as well. Under previous presidents, there's been sort of a informal set of regulations and camaraderie that might be in the Gridiron Club or the Washington Press Club annual dinner, or just the social scene where the presidents would actually have a chance to get to know the journalists as people and vice versa. And that, of course, has been non-existent under Trump. How much do you think those sort of informal institutions and social scenes impact the presidential journalist relations?
You know, I don't think it's necessary for presidents to like socially interact with reporters, but I think it's good when there's a little bit of a relationship. And it matters because we're dealing with each other all the time. You know, for president's presentation to the American people to some degree is through the press corps that covers him. When reporters have a chance to see the president in something other than an adversarial relationship, we can understand him or her better. We have a better sense of what they're like. So there's some cost to both sides, I think, to have this very adversarial relationship we have right now. President Trump does some things with reporters. President Trump often comes back and talks off the record with reporters on Air Force One. For instance, there's been a tradition of that. I've interviewed the president twice, President Trump twice. Both times he's been extremely friendly and engaging in a way that you might not expect when you see the back and forth that's on television. But it's definitely not the relationship that we saw before. It is certainly not the relationship we saw, say, with George H.W. Bush, who knew George H.W. Bush was something like Joe Biden in that he had been around a long time. He knew a lot of reporters. Reporters knew him. and they had a pretty friendly relationship, although that did not always buy George H.W. Bush the kind of friendly press he wished he could have had. But it did help. It helped us understand him better and be able to do a better job of covering him.
And Peter, this is.
Hey, I'm here to ask questions this time.
Peter, you've mentioned this isn't press and presidency, it's president and Congress, but you would get to see President Reagan interact with Tip O'Neill, Speaker of the House, Tip O'Neill, and they might have a long kind of bloody battle throughout the day, but at the end of the day, what would Reagan, what invitation would Reagan offer to Tip?
It's after 6 o'clock. Tip, why don't you come on over to the White House, unless you and I have a chat and see if we can't work this out.
And it might have been over a drink that Tip O'Neill was unlikely to decline.
There were a couple of Irishmen. And, you know, and then when it was done, I mean, it was a situation like with any good politicians. Hey, I'll give on this one if you'll give on this one. Okay, let's shake hands. Now you go out and announce it to the press. And that's, you know, to me, and I'm just sitting down here these days watching from afar, but it seems to me that that kind of camaraderie or that kind of appreciation for each role is missing today. And the ability to compromise on key issues when it's important to the country. And it just seems to me that, I could be wrong, Susan, but it just seems to me that that's not happening much these days. But like I say, I could be wrong, because I know one thing I've learned is people say to me all the time, or a lot of times they'll say, wonder why the president's doing such and such or doing it that way. And I say to them, I said, well, what you have to appreciate is he's the president and he's privy to certain aspects of this that you and I aren't. So he's making decisions based on information that he has privy to. So you kind of always have to appreciate that too. Just to go back to the thing about the gridiron and the Washington about those events, to me too, they were always a great chance. I mean, those are fun events. They're not serious. They're poking fun at both sides. And what better communications tool in life is there than humor? And it's a chance to see a president being humorous, which you don't often get to see. It's certainly not in that circumstance. Susan, the what part about the gridiron I always got a good laugh out of was they'd start out, remember it'd be you really, or whoever the president, I guess, of the gridiron was, and they'd start out and say, first of all, everything that's said here tonight is off the record. And then the next day, the story would all be in the Washington Post. But it was always fun. And I think presidents enjoyed it. And
Susan, who had the best sense of humor of any president? We know that Bill Clinton was your most interesting interview, or the person who was most interviewable, but who had the best sense of humor?
You know, several of them did really funny turns at the gridiron. Ronald Reagan, of course, was a master of delivering a speech. George H.W. Bush had some funny gridiron speeches, including one when he was playing Johnny Carson, you know, along with Marlon Fitzwater, where Johnny Carson wore a turban and answered a question before it was asked. It was like a bit.
Karnak.
No one in your class
Karnak,
remembers
that's right.
who Johnny Carson is, but it was a very funny bit that George H.W. Bush did. George W. Bush had at his last gridiron dinner, he got on stage and sang a song. And that was pretty good too. So Pete's right. It's a way to see the human side of a president that you don't always get to see from the White House briefing room.
you know, somebody else who it turned out, I guess you could say, softened her image that existed at the time by a performance she gave there at a gridiron was Nancy Reagan.
Yeah, secondhand clothes to
Yeah,
that was a great performance, and it was a big help to Nancy Reagan. It really improved her kind of general reputation around town.
Susan, you did. It's weird. I asked you about humor, and you didn't mention Richard Nixon. What oversight did you just have there?
Well, I didn't cover Richard Nixon, so I have no kind of personal perspective there.
I couldn't decide whether to pick on Nixon or Carter, but okay. Jalen Garcia is our last questioner, and she's got questions that cover the very beginning of your career up into the future, 2021. So Jalen, fire away.
Hi, Mrs. Page. It's so nice to meet you. My name is Jalen Garcia, and I am from Corpus Christi, Texas. I am a senior mass communications major here at Sam Houston State. My question for you is, what made you choose journalism over music?
I just love journalism. I love doing reporting. I love going out and seeing things when they're happening. I love trying to explain them to people, make sense of them. And so when I was a senior in high school, it was a really hard decision to make. Looking back on it, I can't imagine having made any other decision. Lucky me. Maybe I would have loved being an oboist, but I feel pretty good about having decided to be a journalist.
Susan, we need to get you on the oboe, Condi Rice on the piano, and Bill Clinton on the saxophone.
Man, that sounds like a terrible, terrible idea, but okay.
Hey, we need something to bring the parties and the press and the officials back together again. Jalen, fire away with the last question of the session.
Absolutely. I was just going to add in that I actually come from a family of musicians, so I was kind of the oddball for picking journalism. So we have that in common. My last question is about your book that we've heard so much about from previous questions that's set to launch in April 2021, called Madam Speaker, Nancy Pelosi and the Lessons of Power. If you could just give us a teaser on what to expect from your newest book.
So actually, my final deadline for this book is in 2 weeks. So I'm frantically trying to finish it. I thought that 2020 would be a less newsworthy year than it was. So I've had a lot to cover this year. Here are some ways in which Nancy Pelosi and Barbara Bush are pretty different in some ways. Barbara Bush was the spouse of Nancy Reagan. Nancy Pelosi has been the candidate herself. Barbara Bush, a Republican, a conservative Republican, Nancy Pelosi, a liberal Democrat, but they're alike in some ways. And they're alike in two ways that I thought made them both good topics for a biography. One is that they've been consequential. Barbara Bush made a difference. Things are different now because Barbara Bush was around. And that is true for Nancy Pelosi too. And while Nancy Pelosi would have been in the history books as the first woman speaker, the highest ranking woman in the history of the American government, she'd be in the history books anyway because she did consequential things in her job as speaker, including passing legislation during the 2008 financial meltdown and pushing through approval of the Affordable Care Act. That's one thing that appealed to me. The other thing that appealed to me was that I think that both Barbara Bush and Nancy Pelosi have been underappreciated. They've been misjudged because of sexism and other reasons. They've been discounted, and they kind of persevered against that to do big things in ways that people didn't always acknowledge. So that was something else that I like. One other thing I found out only when I started the book on Nancy Pelosi was that Nancy Pelosi and Barbara Bush were good friends, which you wouldn't necessarily expect. They were not too far apart in age. Barbara Bush was 15 years older than Nancy Pelosi is, but when I went into the speaker's office to do the first interview for the book with Nancy Pelosi, there on the mantle is a picture of her with the Bush family, the big Bush family. And she told me that she agreed to do an event at the George H.W. Bush Library in College Station, and that it had become somewhat controversial because College Station, pretty conservative campus, Nancy Pelosi, big famous San Francisco liberal, coming there. And she arrives at the library and Barbara Bush comes out to greet her on the steps and says, "I want to apologize to you." And Nancy Pelosi said, "Why?" And Barbara Bush says, "I'm sorry we don't have more demonstrators here," because they only had like a handful of demonstrators on the steps. So that was something that actually Nancy Pelosi thought was pretty funny. So a surprise to me that these two women that I've spent so much time kind of exploring their lives turned out to have this connection with one another.
And Susan, did you ask Nancy when you interviewed her for your book, did you say, would you have been Speaker of the House had you not married Paul?
You know, that's a great question, and I did not ask it, so shame on me.
Jaylan, thank you for your great book-ending questions, bringing us from her early career-choosing days to the next step in an illustrious career with the publication of a timely book. Susan, there's some discussion that maybe Democrats are looking for a new speaker, that the election results were not as robust for the Democrats as they had anticipated. Is this just the normal kind of after-election grousing?
Well, Democrats are disappointed in the House elections and the Senate elections, but Democrats have lost several seats in the House. They thought they were going to gain some. They thought they might gain 5 to 10 or even more. So the leaders bear some responsibility for what happens in elections. I think that the Democrats will choose their leaders on November 18th. I would be really surprised if Nancy Pelosi is significantly challenged for another term as Speaker, but I think she is likely to say this will be her last 2 years as the Democratic leader.
Thank you. And Peter, I'll turn it over to you, but Susan, I do want to thank you very much. I mean, you've got a deadline in 2 weeks, and I know what, not with a book, but with other deadlines, I know what that's like. And so I appreciate you taking that time. And Peter, I appreciate you letting me be a part of this. And I'll let you ask any final questions or just provide the close. Thank you, though, for letting me be a part of this.
You betcha, Mike. And Susan, Mike's exactly right. I know what it's like when you're crashing on a book deadline. So let me just add to the thank you to that for you doing this, because I know we're taking up time you would otherwise be working on that. First of all, be sure and give Carl my best, your husband, and tell him I've got some baseball cards I want to talk to him about. You know, you're talking about Barbara Bush here. Of course, it brings back a lot of memories for me. I remember one time up in Kennebunkport, she told me and Neil Bush to go out on a horrible day to go out and catch some bluefish, because nobody caught any all summer and everybody was kind of down about that. So we went out and we caught 2 of the biggest bluefish you've ever seen. I couldn't wait to get back to the house to show them to her. So we got back there, we walked in, she was at the sink where had her back to us, and I waited at the doorway and I held this fish, and it's not a fish story. This was a big fish. She turned around, I said, she looked at him, she said, okay, what supermarket did you buy them in? Now, if that isn't Barbara Bush, that's the essence of Barbara Bush.
Exactly like Barbara Bush. And Pete, before we end this, just want to thank you and Mike and also all the students who asked such great questions. I know you have a lot of juniors and seniors. I hope they have a great next year of their college education and a fantastic careers to follow that. And it's been my pleasure to be with you this evening.
Well, on their behalf, go ahead, Mike.
Well, just real quick, you know, when you call Carl about the baseball cards, I would time it with the first royalty check from the Nancy Pelosi book, because I think your price can be a lot higher.
Well, on behalf of the students, Susan, let me say thank you again, because, you know, when I was in college, I would have loved to have heard someone such as yourself. Let me ask you just one last thing, because I do have such regard for your ability and the profession in which you're engaged. And the question quite simple, and this is looking into the future, where do you think will be in terms of print journalism, say 10 years from now?
So I think print journalism is not the way of the future. I don't think that's if we had asked your students about how many of them read print publications instead of online ones, I suspect the number who read print publications are pretty small. That does not worry me. I'm not worried about the delivery system. I'm worried about the journalism. And you can do great journalism for print publications, but you can also do great journalism for online publication, and that is the direction we're going. I think that time is coming when we already have some medium-sized cities that have no print newspaper being circulated. As I said, that's not the problem. The problem is, do you have some other form of delivery of the kind of journalism, the kind of accountability journalism that we need in this country?
Words of wisdom. Somebody asked me recently, who are the giants of journalism these days? I said, well, as far as I'm concerned, Susan Page is a giant of journalism. And I say that with the greatest regard and respect. And also just seeing you and hearing you talking here has brought back a lot of memories too. And I look back at those days fondly. So, and my message is, you're doing great stuff. Keep it up.
Well, thank you so much, Pete.
And thanks again. And you take care. And good night on behalf of Sam Houston State University.
Great.
Thank you.
Nice to be with you.